there's a new librela study about musculoskeletal adverse events. The too long didn't read is that the musculoskeletal adverse events were 9 times higher in librela compared to other drugs. But how did they come to this, and what does this mean? Librela has been in the news a lot lately because of things like FDA open letters and social media talking about the side effects. One of the biggest side effects is an increase in lameness or limping after getting librela. They used this database from the EU, which is used to get all of these adverse events together, and they looked at musculoskeletal adverse events in particular, and compared librela versus all of these other NSAIDs. And then they reached out to other veterinary specialists and asked for cases of RPOA, or rapidly progressing osteoarthritis. They comprised a group to look at this, but they also brought human medicine in because this isn't really well reported in veterinary medicine. And they filed them into 3 groups: very suspicious, suspicious, or insufficient evidence to say that librela caused this. And over the course of 3.5-ish years, they had 4,746 musculoskeletal adverse events that were identified. And after exclusion, about 3,755 of these were attributed to librela. But about 80% of those were excluded because of confounding neurologic or systemic cancers, bringing it down to 878. And 90% of those cases attributed to librela. And what they found was that ligament and tendon injury, polyarthritis, fracture, musculoskeletal neoplasia, and septic arthritis were about 9 times more frequently reported in librela than the other medication. And that there were more adverse events reported for librela than all of the other medications. Which did not support their null hypothesis was that librela's side effects would not exceed that of competitor drugs by more than 50%. They did talk a lot about this serious versus not serious side effects, and if it was appropriate to classify them as such. Now, what about those 19 cases? Suspected rapidly progressing osteoarthritis was about 6 months after about 13 of the cases. 11 dogs also had regular concurrent NSAIDs, which we'll talk about. 7 dogs had pathologic fractures and 2 had luxations. Here's a chart summary of those 19 cases. This top was very suspicious of being related, and this saying that they're not suspicious of being related down here. And they do show these cases individually. This is the one that shared the most, where we see the limb here 8 months before starting treatment, and this at about 2.5 years later, also after 23 librela injections. And they did talk about the way these adverse events are calculated. Like if you look at anti-inflammatories, we know that they can cause GI upset. And if you look at GI upset for every actual pill sold, it ends up being less than 1,000 and 10,000 doses, which would call it a very rare side effect, which we know in vet med is not really a good way to describe this. Yet the recent report by Zoetis that I covered last week showed adverse events per injection, which they call out as a way to underreport side effects. They also show some weakness in these reporting systems, like a lack of comprehensive terminology, like it doesn't have RPOA as a diagnostic term. And I want to talk about some of the chatter that's been going on behind the scenes with veterinarians about this paper. One being, could this RPOA happen because these dogs are suddenly feeling better, they're overexerting themselves and then injuring those joints? However, human medicine tried to have a type of librela and it hasn't really panned out. And that's because they were seeing this rapidly progressive osteoarthritis in some of these patients. And they weren't sure if it's because these patients were taking NSAIDs as well. But when they lowered the dose or prohibited NSAID use, they still saw this risk of rapidly progressing osteoarthritis, and they don't really know why. And if you look at this chart I showed earlier, a lot of these dogs were on concurrent NSAIDs. And while this is absolutely catastrophic for these pets and these pet owners, 19 cases is not a whole lot. And that once you're adjusting for things like systemic illness, which is another argument that some people have had, is saying that we use this drug in older patients as a last resort. So are there confounding issues like underlying cancers that we didn't know about? And to say that 789 cases, while again, awful, these are pets that are owned by people, these aren't just numbers, is not that high of a number. And so should we stop using a medication that is actually helping quite a few patients because these rare side effects can be very catastrophic? At the end of the day, it comes down to an individual conversation, right? Why did we choose this medication for this pet? Are the potential side effects worse than the disease? Do the owners have informed consent about these potential side effects? Were the safety trials adequate in order to get these drugs approved? Why are these side effects so country dependent? And did veterinarians have a full scope of these possible adverse events when this drug was marketed toward them? What do you think?